Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Alice Zheng, who is the principal at RH Capital, a venture fund investing in early-stage, high-impact companies across the reproductive and maternal health landscape. Alice holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and MD and MPH from the University of Michigan. Alice was previously a women's health practice leader at McKinsey. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we talk about femtech and women's health, which is gathering some momentum of late, investment thesis of RH Capital and ways they work with founders, opportunities and challenges in the space, and also try to cover some topics that can help encourage aspiring female founders and investors not yet in the space. I was introduced to Alice by a good friend of mine, Neil Ray, who was previously a guest on my show, as I wanted to learn about investors in women's health. I'm hoping to learn a lot about the space and hope you will too. Alice, I've been really looking forward to this conversation with you, as you're my first guest focused on investing in women's health. Maybe to begin, it would be helpful to introduce you to the audience. You got a really interesting background, a medical doctor by training, MBA from Harvard, McKinsey, and then now investing. Maybe you could describe what has united every major career stop that you've had so far and the decision-making process to how you ended up in investing.
Sure, yes. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I heard great things, and I know you've spoken with at least one of our portfolio companies. So excited to join, and even more excited that you're interested in the topic of women's health. Many times I feel like I am talking to others who are already in the space and we're preaching to the choir, but it's always really exciting to hear about others who are becoming interested and see this become a more mainstream topic. Yeah, and then to start out, just to introduce myself, yes, I've had many career pivots in my life. I would say I've always been driven by curiosity to learn and find the best way to make an impact. And at different stages, there's definitely been different considerations. So when I first started my career, I was in global public health. I actually worked with a variety of nonprofits in East Africa and Asia. And I was very much driven by values of supporting those who are most underserved from a healthcare standpoint in our society across the world. And I would say those same values are the ones that drove me to all the different career steps, including where I am today. So after a stint in the global public health world, I went into clinical medicine with the idea that I wanted to make an impact from the physician angle. And that is something I still hold near and dear to my heart. But I realized that there are others who can treat a pneumonia better than I could, who could deliver a baby better than I can. But there's not as many people, or at least at the time, this is 10, 15 years ago, not as many who are at the intersection of medicine, business, and public health. So after spending a year in medical residency and after getting an MBA, I decided not to pursue clinical medicine. It was a very difficult decision because any pre-meds out there know it takes significant investment personally, professionally to pursue that path. And at this point, I had gone pretty far down the path, but again, realized that where I could most uniquely make an impact and find fulfillment was not as a practicing day-to-day physician. So I went to McKinsey to really learn about the business world. And you can get a degree, you can get an MBA, but that doesn't mean that you actually know how things work or that you can do anything. And I really saw consulting as a bit of a residency in business. And indeed, I got to work with a lot of different types of companies, see the inner workings of how hospitals work, how pharmaceutical companies work. I also worked with global health organizations. Women's health was a theme through all of this. It was the initial entry into global health. It was a big focus in the clinical world. And also when I was in consulting, it was a big focus as well. I made the transition then into venture capital from consulting for a couple of different reasons. One is the external world was really changing within women's health. 5 years ago, it was a topic that was very much not mainstream. It was very much considered a niche area. Even from the consulting perspective, there weren't that many clients in it. By the time I left consulting, there was just an incredible amount of interest, I would say, from many of the larger companies. But even more so astoundingly, there was a ton happening in the innovation ecosystem. Funds were being started just on women's health to focus in women's health investing. A plethora of startups were coming into existence. There was more and more public discourse. And I realized that to really make an impact the way that I want to in women's health and innovation, then that was the right time to jump into that space. Investing is just really a ton of fun. I really like to have a bird's eye view on an industry. And so it made a lot of sense to me to play within the innovation ecosystem from that angle in particular, where all of my clinical expertise, business experience with different types of companies, and having just seen the landscape from a bird's eye view could really be utilized as an investor to both make investments and support companies.
Fascinating journey. Looks like curiosity and wanting to create an impact on the world seem to be driving forces. And with your background, I'm sure you can go to any venture capital firm, and you chose something what we call as a femtech. Maybe you can set the frame here by talking about what femtech is from your point of view, because I think it's relatively new now. Give the big picture of femtech overview and the challenges that are facing this space.
Sure, yes. And I would love to talk about the fund that I'm at, which is called RH Capital. We are a fund that is focused exclusively on women's health conditions. I would actually use the word women's health over femtech. I personally find that the term has played a really great role in elevating the conversation on women's health, but sometimes it can be a limiting term in some ways if you interpret it as the tech side only. Others may use it broadly. As a fund, we focus on women-specific issues, and we are very broad in terms of sectors. So we look at the life sciences, diagnostics, therapeutics, as well as things on the digital health and health services and even consumer side. And what's really important to me is that our fund is also very impact focused. So as I mentioned, throughout all the different stages of my career, I've always been seeking what are the ways to live out my values and make the type of impact that I think is most meaningful. And at our fund, we are a for-profit venture capital fund as any other, but we also have a very strong impact focus where we look for companies that are able to address very underserved issues and or populations. And happy to talk about that more a little bit later. But to answer your question, why this fund? Well, I really want to be an investor in women's health. There are a handful of funds that are doing this. And B, the impact piece is very important to me. So I really love our mission on both the women's health side and the impact side. And then to your question on what is femtech / women's health. So femtech specifically as a term, I came into being over the last 5 or so or slightly longer years. It was first coined by Ida Tin, the founder of Clue, which is a period tracker. At the time, my understanding with the story was that she was having a hard time explaining what her company was doing. People were trying to figure out, what do I think of you as? Are you a consumer company? Are you a wearable? Are you digital? What are you? And so she coined the term femtech, meaning technology for female health. There are some that use this definition to mean women's health-focused companies that have a technology angle. So you might be digital, or maybe you're digitally connected. It tends to be more consumer-focused. The conversation has broadened, and there are some that use the word femtech to mean anything women's health, including pharmaceuticals, including medical devices. So no matter how you hear of it, I think the underlying trend and what's really important to note is that women's health issues are becoming more of a mainstream topic. Previously stigmatized, ignored, underinvested by many incumbents in healthcare. We don't have a lot of new drugs in women's health. It doesn't have the same intention as some other therapy areas. For many reasons, things are starting to change. femtech, I guess, to those of us who have been in this space for a while, we've gone through these different evolutions of language to the mainstream. It's just wonderful that it's even on the map. No matter how you define it or how you're using it, I'm just happy that it's becoming part of mainstream conversations that we need to pay attention to women's health. And there's many reasons. Women, other than being half the population, women make a lot of healthcare decisions for the family. Women make up the majority of the workforce in healthcare. And so there's many reasons why women's health should matter. And it's wonderful to see that the narrative and tension has changed.
Absolutely. I'm just surprised how long it's taking. It hasn't come into full play yet, I think, but I'm glad things are changing. I think that's a nice segue to talk about RH Capital itself. Can you describe the investment thesis of the firm? And can you say more about the kinds of business models and startups that grab your attention?
Sure. So as mentioned earlier, we're focused exclusively on women's issues. So very narrow in that approach, but very broad in terms of types of companies and businesses we look at. So our portfolio includes life science companies, as well as digital health companies, as well as consumer. Even there are a couple of areas that we spend the most time. Our portfolio is very heavy in contraceptives. We see that as a very strong area of unmet need. And we actually have male contraceptives because we believe that is actually an important part for women as well, for men to be taking some of that responsibility on. That's one area we spend a lot of time in. Also, maternal health is important. It's an area where we see significant clinical unmet needs and a lot of health inequities that we want to be solving. So within both of these categories of the companies that we invest in are varied. Some of them are new technologies, new diagnostics, new devices, or therapeutics. Others are more about how you access care, whether it's getting the birth control over the counter so it's more accessible, or on the maternal health side, we have a few companies that are specifically addressing underserved communities, such as Black and Brown mothers who face disproportionate barriers to care. Outside of those two areas, we are also investing in other high-impact women's health conditions, such as STIs, that's sexually transmitted diseases, ovarian cancer. We look actively in areas like menopause and endometriosis. Women's health is an area where there's just needs all around. If you think about from a clinical unmet need standpoint, where do we need better tools for diagnostics and therapeutics, as well as where is there significant patient numbers? And a lot of women's health conditions meet both of those. So it's very much a market that is ripe for disruption. And so we're actually looking for innovations across all of those.
Yeah. How do you qualify the founders that you like to invest in?
There's a lot of different things that we look at in terms of investment. The first thing we look at is this topic area or is this condition being addressed in scope? In scope, meaning it's related to women's health. Also, we got a lot around, is there clinical unmet need here? Do we think that there is an opportunity for impact? And along with that, really, we're looking at our impact pillars. We have 4 of them that we really screen for, and that includes being a very transformative technology. As mentioned, can this really make an impact clinically? The other pillars are around increasing access for underserved communities, as well as reducing health inequities for underserved groups and affordability of products and services. This isn't answering your question directly. You're asking about founders, but we actually do start with the impact piece. Does this overall make sense? And for the founders, absolutely. We work with a lot of amazing founders. Some of them are first-time founders and just doing really amazing work. And that's actually a side note just to highlight is that in women's health, the pipeline is early. There's a handful of companies that have gone on to growth stage, series C, D, E, but a lot of the pipeline is early. And also a number of the entrepreneurs are first-time entrepreneurs. And I point this out because there are some funds who are more biased towards repeat entrepreneurs, but that's not something that would make sense in this space because we're trying to spur innovations that don't exist in areas that have been ignored. So we often work with first-time entrepreneurs and are just very excited to support them on the journey. In terms of entrepreneurs that we work with, We do look at the team. What is the background of the founding team for a more scientific type of product, something like life sciences? Then often the founder has technical background, and that's great. And if you don't, then who have you surrounded yourself with to make sure to bring in that expertise? So that's one thing. And the other is as we go through the diligence process, we are able to get a sense of what is it like to work with this founder? We are going to be in this journey together for some time through ups and downs. And it's important to be able to have a good relationship where you can really build trust, where you can support each other. And so that's something that we look at as well.
Speaking of first-time founders, that is one of the focus of this podcast because a lot of them are first-time founders just sitting on the sidelines. Maybe you can share a story or two of the investment that you or the firm have invested in from the time they approach you with a deck to the point you have invested and also supported them afterwards. How does that look like?
Sure. Yeah. The other thing I'll say about our founders that I really love is that we tend to have also more women and minorities. About 70% of the founders that we work with are either women or people of color. And that's an important thing to highlight from an impact standpoint, because we know that today, a very small percentage of venture capital dollars is actually going into funding for founders of this background. Just very excited to be able to support diversity within this space as well. In terms of working with startups, there's a number of ways that we do collaborate. If there's any type of support we can give with future fundraising, we're often helping make connections to follow-on investors. As an early stage fund, we do reserve for follow-on, but we're not the ones who are going to be investing at the much later stages of B, the C, the D, et cetera. But we know others who are. We have relationships with bigger funds that are playing kind of that later stage. And I would say for startups, we think of ourselves as we're helping bridge in the early stage and the seed stage, sometimes Series A, to help companies get to a proof of concept or into clinical trials. But then ultimately, they're going to need more help scaling. And so to the extent that we can support their investor relationships, support their fundraising approach, their storytelling, and their whole strategy around that, that's something that, number one, first and foremost, want to make sure that these companies are able to continue on and grow successfully. And otherwise, because we're so deeply embedded into the women's health space, we have a lot of resources and expertise. We have numerous companies in maternal health. So we have advisors that we work with, like clinicians that are very deep in this space. We have funding that other funds likely don't have to be able to leverage those resources and provide guidance, feedback, advising to our startups. And just from ourselves, we like to be thought partners. If a company is coming upon a decision around competitive positioning, again, we're so deep in some of these verticals. We have talked to numerous companies in the same space. We've looked very deeply at the landscape to be able to bring some of that expertise to companies to help them with any strategic question, looking at your addressable market or looking at your positioning. Those are things that we really make sure that we bring.
Great. Are there factors that you have observed in the female founders that help them dive into that startup space? Because people are hesitant to start companies, women. What can we do to improve those numbers?
I think that's an interesting question of why are there fewer female founders than male founders? I don't think there's a clear answer to that. We know that there are fewer founders. We know that there's less funding being allocated. It's hard to say the reason, but let's think about resources and solutions. Well, there's a number of female-focused funds that are really focused on bringing more women into the space. And so that is a really great resource. There's funds like Golden Seeds and January Ventures and others who their entire thesis is around female founders. It isn't for us per se, but because of our topic area, we do end up with many female founders. Also, a lot of angels that are really interested in bringing more women into entrepreneurship. There's different incubators and programs surrounding that as well. So I'm not going to hypothesize on why there are fewer female founders, but for those that are excited about this, there are resources that are available. It doesn't completely level the playing field, but it can be a helpful start at least, and getting into the networks of some of these angel investors and these early stage funds, which then pass on to others for the companies to be successful.
Yeah, maybe a different way to ask this question could be, are there unique characteristics or attributes of the founders leading businesses in the space that are helping them relative to other categories in your own portfolio per se?
That's an interesting question. We are obviously impressed with all the founders that we work with, and we choose to invest for specific reasons, both on the need side as well as the team that we really believe in and really back. So we're impressed with, all our female founders, and I would say the same type of grit and tenacity and passion and ability to pull the right people along with you to fill in gaps in expertise that probably applies to all founders. In terms of, is there something different about some of these female ones? I don't know.
You'll come up with some thesis a few years down. This is a new field. I get it. So that's why I'm curious too. I don't know if you have observed anything special that stands out other than the regular grit and things that people talk about.
What we're impressed by our founders, male or female, is that they are addressing areas that we believe are underinvested. And so whatever personality characteristic or background or what it takes to go and to see opportunities that are overlooked where others may not, to see that need and to have the passion to address that is something that we do find in our founders. And there's almost a mutual shared understanding of, yes, we are in women's health. We're not in oncology. We're not in rare disease. We're not in these areas where there's a lot of funding, a lot of activity. We all are bonded through our commitment to a space that is high need and yet underserved. And that's something very powerful when you share that kind of share values with our teammates on the fund side, as well as with our portfolio companies, so that we together celebrate the wins. One thing that I've heard often in the women's health space, which I don't think you'll hear elsewhere, is oftentimes companies that could even be competitors, they support each other and they root for each other because we all know this is huge white spaces in women's health. And I hear more of the sentiment here than I would elsewhere of, I'm so happy that there is this other company. It speaks to the need. We can all expand the pie together. And you root for your competitors in many ways, especially if they're first to market, because you don't want them to fail and have any skepticism cast upon the whole industry. And so I think that type of collaborativeness is a bit unique in women's health because of the white space and because of how underinvested it has been. And I appreciate and I'm struck by that collaborative nature.
That is very encouraging. I don't believe because of how big the space is, only one player is going to take the whole market. I'm really, really impressed by what is happening in the space. A question along those lines is, I read on your website that you try to balance between financial and social returns. How does that work? How do you balance those things?
Yeah, I would say there's been an evolution in how funds and society thinks about impact and financial returns. I would say that 10, 15 years ago, there are a number of impact-focused funds that were very deliberate about having concessionary returns. So that was a strategy. Patient capital, we're not looking for returns very quickly. We recognize we play specifically more on the impact side. But I would say today, that's not so true. There are still different firms and organizations that invest more for social impact purposes and do not seek financial returns. But there are also many funds, such as ourselves, where we are looking for both. So within our fund, even though we screen for impact upfront, we still do all the same diligence that any other fund does on the market, the product, as well as the financial and business case, and whether or not we think that this company and opportunity can generate sufficient exit to warrant investment. So that does mean that there are opportunities that we see that we think are so critical and so needed in society, but may not make sense for venture capital. Venture capital is for a specific type of company. There are plenty of great organizations that are self-sustaining financially. They're profitable. They solve an important need, impact or not, but they're not the best fit for VC per se. So we're looking at it through both lenses, the impact and the financial. And so there are some opportunities that there are not a fit for our fund for one reason or the other, but we also have a network of others who may be more on the impact side, or on the financial side that we can refer these organizations to. But I guess the short answer to your question is we do screen for both. There is a trade-off, as you point out, but we're looking for the intersection where we can have both.
Maybe you have some advice for founders. What do they get wrong about VC firms? And what can they do to improve the chances of getting funded, especially in this space? If you have a decision tree for them to follow, maybe a simple question is, how should a founder qualify an investor?
Sure. Well, fundraising it's a significant task. We fully recognize that and appreciate when founders take the time to reach out. And I would say the types of strategies to get funded in women's health are not dissimilar from venture capital in general, where you want to have a large funnel, a bigger top of the funnel, because you just don't know which fund making decisions is not just about fit, scope, and all the diligence that they would do with you, but sometimes there's other factors like timing. Maybe the fund is winding down and about to raise again. They can't invest until they raise, or maybe they're looking to balance a portfolio. And so your company is amazing and is very much a great opportunity, but the fund internally is trying to balance something out. And so for that reason, it's important in women's health, as just as any other field, to have a big top of the funnel. And I would say doing your homework on what the venture capital firm cares about. What is their scope, both stage-wise, business type, focus area, and how do you fit in so that you can pitch your story to fit that the most? These types of things are similar here in women's health as elsewhere. And of course, warm connections are always very helpful. The women's health space is small, it's growing. The great thing is that these days there are more and more conferences and summits and pitch events where maybe you don't have a direct warm connection to a fund, but by participating in those ecosystem events, you get to know who are the main players here. And I call that a semi-warm connection, where you might meet someone at one of these events that you didn't know before. It's more effective than completely cold outreach. And it doesn't mean that you have to have this person ahead of time. I personally would love to democratize the fund venue a little bit more. I think that it should be tied to having warm connection or not. It just sometimes there are a lot of opportunities, a lot of companies, and it can help when you've just met someone or there's been some touch point of overlap. But our fund, we do also have a web pitch form because we want to ensure that entrepreneurs who maybe are not able to get to those events or just don't have such a wide network are still able to get in touch with us.
Speaking of networks and warm connections, I think in my observations, one of the key ingredients for success of startups is strong networks that founders had. Can you say more about how women can build these networks? I think it has started much before launching a startup. Any advice on that space?
I think there's probably two factors. There's networks that are really important. And the other factor that maybe relates to the previous question is really storytelling. And maybe they're related. To be able to sell to your customers, to attract investors, to attract and retain talent in your company. There's a network piece of it. And there's also the storytelling. And I'm not saying that it's storytelling without actual substance or execution, because you need to be able to execute on it. Oftentimes, especially in the early days, being able to tell a very compelling story about your vision, how you're going to get there in a very clear way is really critical. And again, it's not that as investors, we just want someone who can tell a story, but that really it's more tell the story with the substance behind it, because I know that for you to succeed, you do need to, again, get the customers, get the ecosystem partners, have top talent join your company. And so those two, I would say, go hand in hand. In terms of how best to build a network, there's lots of different routes. If you're already in the space, leveraging any of those connections, if you are part of any affiliations, any groups, there are from your business school or maybe from graduate school or undergrad, really seeking out others who are doing something similar or adjacent. Maybe it's a fellow founder who can give you advice and guidance on how to start a company, or it's an investor who is not even in your field, not in the same space, but can still speak to, in general, how to think about your fundraising strategy. Really, they could be a very wide net. It doesn't have to be networked with people directly related to what you're doing to be able to learn. And that person might know someone else who is in the space that you're in to be able to introduce you to. That can be really helpful. So starting with your warm connections for sure. Then also what I call the semi-warm, being in the conversations, being at the table at different gatherings and events where it is focused on the topic you're interested in. That's another great way to build networks. And these days, it doesn't even have to be in person. There are a lot of really great high quality virtual gatherings where you can get to know who are the key players in the space that you want to be in, who are the other entrepreneurs, who are the main investors, and others. Let's get creative. Who are the payers that might be one day where you're trying to get your product reimbursed? Who are partners that you might be working with? Potential CROs if you are in the life sciences. And so I think thinking broadly about the network as well is not just who's going to invest in your company, but all those other types of stakeholders matter a lot. And one other thing I would say is also who might want to join you in the journey, networking to meet potential co-founders, potential first employees, all of that is contribute.
All great points. I come from the academic world where I deal with a lot of grad students and postdocs, and they do a bad job, both the students and also academia as an institution, in terms of telling them how important networking is. And for example, they have engineering, they have sciences, they have MBAs. Most people are stuck in the labs and they just don't make that effort. I really hope that changes, because I think that's going to be a key catalyst in more founders coming out because they don't have the network.
Yeah. And thank you for reminding me that. I feel like I've been away from academia for so long. I've kind of forgotten that mindset. And if I think back to when I was in business school at HBS, there was a specific program called the iLab where the idea was to actually bring people together across disciplines, because the business students had certain type of skills, the engineers had different skills, and then clinicians. And there are often in academic settings, there are structures in place for this. But of course, there's also organic ways you can go about and do this yourself. I think the main mantra for me is that there's something to learn from everyone that you're meeting. You can definitely be intentional about who you're trying to network with and meet. But in general, even if they're not in your field, there's probably something you can learn. There's some connection this person might be able to make for you down the line. So definitely you're the networking. And then again, that hand in hand, what is your elevator pitch for yourself? Or if you already have a vision for a company, what is that pitch that you will tell, kind of sell, essentially? Which sell, I feel like, is like a dirty thing in academia, but ultimately we're all selling an idea or selling a concept or a company or something. And so I also think that's something that is not focused on a lot in academia. It's the mentality maybe is a bit more of I'll do good work, keep my head down, and something good will come. But to really put yourself out there and be selling yourself and be meeting people maybe can be uncomfortable, but it can lead to really great outcomes. And I'm saying this because you reminded me,
yes,
back in that mindset. I've been in this other world so long.
Academia has been bad. They don't teach us how to sell. They don't teach us that storytelling. They talk about science and engineering, not in a good way, but in terms of data. Let's slightly shift the gears and talk about macro things. That one of the topics we talked about was not enough investments are flowing into women's health. We briefly discussed about encouraging other investors to invest in the space, even though they don't understand that well. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. How can a firm like you influence other investors to invest more money into women's health?
I think there are a couple of topics here. One, it would be, why is women's health underinvested? Happy to address that. The second would be, how can we specifically as RH Capital help get more capital in the space? And then I would say just broadly, what is needed to galvanize more? So why has women's health been underinvested? I think there's a couple of reasons. One is the topic areas have generally been a bit more stigmatized. Who 10 years ago, would be comfortable going into a pitch or meeting and talking about vaginas and uteruses. And I can say these words very comfortably as a former aspiring doctor, but they're in the startup and investing world where it was very heavily male dominated. It can be uncomfortable. And these topics, even for women, talking about menstruation can be a little bit stigmatized. And I think that narrative is changing, which is great. The first step is able to talk about the problems and talk about the issues at hand. And some other reasons, there is I think, some gender biases here. There was an article that we talked about before where a researcher looked at patents and who was innovating and getting patents and what issues were they focusing on. And we know that there's many more men in science and STEM than women. And what this professor found is that the teams that were mostly male tended to focus on male issues, whereas the teams that were mostly female looked at male and female issues. And so because you have many more male teams, then female issues weren't getting as much attention, even as early as in the basic research phase to the patenting phase. And then you think about, okay, then who's starting companies and who's funding companies? And there's just less representation across all of those steps. And so that can contribute to why women's health is underserved and underinvested. And I don't mean to paint a negative picture because things are changing. And it's very exciting to see these change. But just if we trace historically how have things worked before, women's health has been a bit of a white space. So what is the role for a fund like ours, like RH Capital? Well, we like to think that because we are so deep in this space, we have expertise that can hopefully help others who are less certain, who don't know the space as well, are less confident, gain that confidence. Because when we do diligence on the science side, we go extremely deep. We're early stage fund, but we go very, very deep in looking at the science and validating that along with other components. But we do focus a lot on the technicals. And because we look at a lot of companies in the same space, we have that institutional knowledge stays over time. It's not like each time we look at a new device or therapeutic in contraception or maternal health. For another fund, it might be a completely new area. There's a whole learning curve. But for us, we've developed the expertise to be able to really be discerning. And we share our memos with others. Even when we don't invest, we may pass on a company because of stage or portfolio balancing or some other reason, but we're still very supportive. We want to make our expertise available to others who don't understand the specific conditions or treatment options so that other investors can get more comfortable with the opportunity. So there are a couple of ways that we think about it. And then the third part to me is, well, what is needed in general to get more investment in women's health? Well, I would say we've made a really good case as an industry on the numbers being high, as in women are half the population. A lot of conditions are very prevalent. 1 in 10 women have endometriosis. Every woman at some point that reaches midlife will go through menopause. There's huge patient numbers. We made that case. We made a case around unmet need. Menopause is it's a space where there's lack of education and lack of diagnostic tools and lack of great treatment options. Endometriosis, like there's a lot of areas of unmet need. So we made that case. I think we've also made an equity case as there's more and more awareness around gender equity in general. I think that the health of women kind of falls into that as well. The case that I think is developing but needs to be even emphasized more is the business case. Is that beyond the numbers, the clinical need, the equity angle, this also makes financial sense. And that's what we truly believe, or else we wouldn't be making venture capital investments in this space. But I think that is an angle that would need to be made even stronger, more apparent for more investors to join in. And I think it's starting to, because if you have an area with big market numbers in terms of population size and unmet need, then that's a white space that's ripe for disruption. And therefore, if you have a great solution, then that can translate into financial reward. And so that, to me, the next argument to really solidify is that business case.
Why did that not happen? Business case makes sense to me, like have the population. And I think that is the key. We need to make that business case. Hopefully that will take off. Speaking of other investors in the space, are there other female investing firms investing in women's health? They are much more successful, maybe. They are much more aggressive. They are much more optimistic. Are there lessons that we can learn from other investors?
Well, maybe I'll take a different angle to discuss this, which is in the past 3 or 4 years, there's been an increasing number of women's health focused funds, which is, again, just really promising, exciting. For us, they're co-investors, they're collaborators. We speak with other similar ones very often. Each fund has a slightly different focus. So we have a very strong impact focus in specific areas we spend more time in. Some others might be more on the life science side, and maybe some are more on the consumer side. So there's slightly different focuses, but all in all, I think what this speaks to is that there is opportunity because there are numerous of these, similar to us, a handful, So I guess depending on how you look at it, it could be a lot or little. There's maybe half a dozen or so. The emergence of funds like this is just promising in general. That means that there are LPs, investors into funds that are seeing the opportunity for these funds to be able to fundraise and then to support entrepreneurs. The other trend that we're seeing is more generalist funds that are developing a thesis in women's health. Whereas maybe 5 years ago, many of the bigger funds had one investment. It wasn't part of any specific thesis in women's health. It was just part of their generalist investing strategy. But now more and more of them, I'm hearing these, really established big Silicon Valley funds are thinking about women's health in a more intentional way, whether it's on the life science side or the digital health side, et cetera. And that's really promising as well, because the women's health focus funds were mostly early stage, and we definitely need these other investors to also be playing in the space and carrying some of these companies through.
Yeah. If you have to make a business case, what are the biggest opportunities that you see or the next spaces that people should go and invest in?
Yeah. So when I think about what is the business case, I do start with some of the other factors, which is, let's take a space like endometriosis. So here's an area that has high volume. There's 1 in 10 women are thought to have endometriosis. There's a lot of need. There's no diagnostic tool today that's on the market that is effective and non-invasive. The journey takes many years. It may require an invasive surgery, and we don't have great treatment options. The treatment options that exist to date are all about shutting down your reproductive system. It basically puts you into menopause. And so if someone can develop a non-invasive diagnostic and or a non-hormonal treatment option that does not put you into menopause, that would be the type of innovation that could command certain types of reimbursement, certain types of premium payment, again, multiply by this large volume of people. That is very compelling. And the good news I'll say is that even though endometriosis hasn't seen much innovation come to market in decades, there are a lot of companies that are developing. They are in clinical trials or animal testing exactly for diagnostics and for different therapeutics. But it takes time. There's going to be a lag. It'll take time for these innovations to come to market. As investors, we're kind of looking for those early signals. And so, yes, we're actively looking in endometriosis, I would say, as an example of an area where there is a strong business case.
Yeah, it's a problem. I have friends and family suffering with that. I know it's painful. One more question along these lines is, are there geographies around the world that are doing a good job in investing in women's health?
Well, I guess let's think about investing. Does that mean in the private sector or the public sector? If you take a bird's eye view at where is the innovation, I did some of this in my consulting life where we take all the different companies tagged to women's health in different databases on startups. Where do they appear? Unsurprisingly, there's a lot in the US and in Europe. The database is probably biased though, because these are English databases. So they're probably not covering certain regions as well. That said, if we just think about VC as an industry globally, there are certain geographies where there's more of that. I would say even in the US, there's more women's health companies based on the coast, which also kind of reflects the general innovation and VC ecosystem, unsurprisingly. I would say though, there are other types of stakeholders that are investing. So if you think about governments and others, in France, there's been a big push around endometriosis from the French government. That's been really promising. In the UK, there was a strategy released recently, and I'm using the right terms, but some kind of renewed focus from the government around women's health, both on the innovation side as well as service delivery, like a statement put out by the government saying, we are really going to focus on this, double down on it. And there are some tangible efforts that are happening, such as making hormone replacement available over the counter or making contraceptives available over the counter. It's a different lens to investing, right? Maybe you're asking more specifically about private sector investing, but I actually broaden and look at what are governments and policymakers doing. And these are all very promising types of moves. And it does affect the private sector because if certain countries are giving more grants around women's health or improving the infrastructure for care delivery, that will make a difference in the outcomes and also for the companies that we would invest in, because maybe some of them are getting grant funding from the government or have access to biobanks or have more collaborators for clinical trials. So we keep an eye on that as well. And I wish I could say the same about the US, but it seems like we've moved in the opposite direction. We've had this whole discussion on women's health, and we haven't talked about the overturning yet of Roe v. Wade, but that is very much the opposite of where we would like to see our country and government go.
Thank you for plugging in the role of government, and it's a sad thing that happened in the US. On the context of Roe v. Wade, how can the innovation ecosystem help the general people to fight issues arising from this decision? Any thoughts?
Absolutely. One of my colleagues, Stacia, and I just wrote an article about this. I think I may have shared it. Perhaps you could share with your listeners as well. First and foremost, it's disappointing as a woman, as someone who's been a patient in women's health. I admitted that in my introduction, but I've experienced many of the health issues myself. It's just very disappointing and disheartening to try to spin in a more positive light. How can we use this as a galvanizing force? Well, on one hand, no matter what your religious, personal, ethical beliefs around abortion are, there is no doubt that this makes women's health even more important, because this means that if more people are pregnant and having children in a country where maternal health already does not have great outcomes, the US has worse outcomes than any of its country peers. And within that, minority women have disproportionately worse outcomes. So against that backdrop, now you're going to have more pregnancies. It's imperative to invest in maternal health solutions to ensure safe pregnancies and better outcomes for all. Also, it makes contraception more important. If women are not able to access abortions for unplanned pregnancies, or sometimes, honestly, even planned pregnancies, sometimes things go wrong, but it makes contraception even more important. And so part of the arguments that we made in our paper are really about doubling down on prevention and investing in maternal health. And the other areas would be, well, so now some women can't access abortion care directly, but what about medication abortion? That's an area that has been growing, unsurprisingly, given recent events. And there are a couple of companies in that space that definitely could be scaled. And there will be new areas as well, areas that we haven't thought of yet today. And there's new white spaces that are created given all the different state by state regulations on when is personhood, what is a cutoff, what qualifies, what doesn't qualify. So some examples might be things like maybe mobile clinics that can maybe be parked around state borders. And there actually is a nonprofit that's doing that to provide care for those who at least can access those regions, or maybe solutions that help women find out faster that they're pregnant to be able to meet certain cutoffs in certain states. So there's just a couple ideas, but as time goes on, I know that there will be even other new white spaces that emerge. So to us, it's a galvanizing force to get more investors to join us on this mission, for us to continue investing in the areas that we do, and to really continue and support with our entrepreneurs that the role that they play is just so important in this wake, in the backlash of the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, I really hope this crisis actually drives innovation in the space, that no law or no government should hold women hostage. I'm very clear about that, especially when it comes to women's health. Men should not have a say, I think, because they're free human beings. Sticking to that topic and going down the thread of women's health, one of the topics that comes up again and again is about maternity leave, and especially if female entrepreneur is in a childbearing age group, they need to take time off. How is the investor community looking at that in terms of supporting female founders? Is there any discussion happening around that if they need to take 3 months off? Startups are hard. The grind is very brutal. Taking 3 to 6 months off is like a big deal for anybody. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is a bigger question around gender equity and family building. And it's tough because biologically, maternity leave is generally not an option, whereas I feel like paternity leave sometimes can be an option because the physical types of recovery that are needed, or if you're breastfeeding, the type of that biological and physical nature of it that the childbearing mother bears is different. And I've seen some female entrepreneurs barely take a mat leave, and I understand why they make that decision. And to your point, it's hard to leave a company that you're running for a very long time. But that definitely isn't what's best for them as a human, as everyone can choose how they want to parent. But most likely they're facing a lot of pressures in that regard. And while corporations in America, the benefits pale in standard compared to some European countries, from Canada, there's at least is still more protected time in larger companies than in startups, so it can definitely be tough. I have seen examples where female co-founders are able to take the proper time. It just takes more pre-planning, and also you need someone very strong to be able to balance while you're out. So I've seen cases where there's two co-founders and one of them will step up more while the other one is on maternity leave. But I don't have a great answer because I think it is just really hard. Even from the large company standpoint, there's different policies that are tested and tried, and I'm not sure if they totally succeeded in helping make it more equitable. Things like maybe paternity leave should be just as long as maternity leave, or having programs for female employees after mat leave to ramp back. There's a lot of efforts, I would say, to address this at kind of the large company level, but for startups, it definitely is very tough. I would just hope that leaders of organizations role model for their employees, because as a company grows, there will surely be other reproductive age men and women. And this is the same for investment funds too, because we often are small teams as well. That role modeling is just really important. How the leadership takes or doesn't take a leave that can say something to the rest of the team. So it's a hard decision to make. I guess the best thing I could say is to find the right support at home and also within your organization to be able to take what you feel is sufficient.
Yeah, it's a hard question. The reason I bring is just to probe any new solutions, because most founders might not have had a kid. They don't know what a woman or a parent would go through. It's hard to imagine that, but I really hope there's education around that space. But hey, Alice, you've been very, very patient with me and providing a lot of education to me. Are there topics that we haven't talked about, either about the firm or the space?
I think, yeah, this has been a really interesting conversation. I love that we've touched on so many different things. The last thing I'll say is if you are a founder or enthusiast or investor or just anyone interested in women's health, please don't hesitate to reach out. I and the fund would love to hear from you. While we invest seed to Series A, we like to get to know folks before then as well, including with academics. Maybe the technology has not spun out, but always like to hear about what's happening and form relationships. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Caveat, speaking of maternity leave, I will be on maternity leave later this year, but happy to pass on to one of my colleagues if I'm not around.
Alice, thank you so much. This is really a big learning experience for me, and I'm hoping my audience will experience this as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.